Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write great fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, and I've just lost my picture here, so I look a little frazzled, but I'll be joining you again in just a second. And I'm from Fresno. I'm the author of about 40 books. About 30 of them or so are novels.
You lost your picture there, Pops?
I did. I clicked on something I shouldn't have clicked on, and now let's just try the old back. And still with me?
I am still with you, and the good news is we can still see your lovely face.
Well, then that's really all that matters. I'm not sure what happened here, but
really, yeah. I invited you on the show for eye candy. That's really what it was. So it has nothing to do with your knowledge and your experience writing novels. It's just because you're nice to look at.
Yeah.
So that's what it is.
Yeah, you are desperate, man.
Oh, good times. Well, we appreciate you guys joining us, and if you'll notice, we are recording at a different time tonight. We're normally not a Saturday night kind of a podcast, but next week's going to be a little bit hectic for us. If you listened last week, or I guess, yeah, if you listened live last week, you'll remember my sister is going in for brain surgery on Wednesday. They are repairing a leak, and this is kind of a follow-up surgery from the one that she had this summer. So our hearts and thoughts are with her, and next week especially as she goes in. Wednesday is when she'll actually have the surgery. Definitely thinking about her. And so we're going to try and leave next week as open as possible. So we wanted to go ahead and do our podcast tonight on Saturday while we had some free time to bring you guys into the fold so you don't have to wait a week for our wonderful writing knowledge. Thought we'd drop that on you real quick. Now, if you are interested in helping my sister out, you'll see the web address right down there on the bottom. This is back right on the bottom of the screen right there. GoFundMe.com/9S. I believe that's an L7HG. And she could use some money to kind of help out with some of the expenses that come along with this. So if you are feeling generous around the Christmas time, it's Christmas season, good time for that, she would definitely appreciate any help that way. Of course, if you can't support her financially, supporting her in prayer would also be very beneficial, and we thank you to those of you who have already done so. I noticed some of you have popped on and helped out, and every little bit helps, so we really are appreciative of that. So we're going to go ahead and jump in tonight, unless Pops, unless you wanted to add anything to that.
Nope. I've got the picture back, so that's a good thing. So at least I know my camera's pointed the right direction now.
Excellent. Well, we are doing ensemble casts when 3 is a crowd. So ensemble casts are a lot of fun, but let's just kind of start off with a quick definition of what an ensemble cast is. So, Pops, you want to handle that?
Sure. In most novels, you have a primary protagonist and an antagonist of some sort, and you follow the protagonist as he or she tries to solve the problem that's presented to him or her, and pretty much goes it alone. But then there are times when you want to have a team that does something, and those are usually called ensemble casts. They're very big in television. You see them, of course, in movies, and they're done quite a bit in novels, but they present unique challenges. So an ensemble cast, you're going to have a primary protagonist. You're going to have a set of characters that makes the protagonist work possible to do. You'll usually have one antagonist. He might have his own ensemble too, and then there's usually a host of ancillary characters that go together with all of that. So an ensemble cast is a protagonist and very active supporters.
And of course, it's a lot of fun for the reader, but it can be very confusing, as you might imagine, too many people on one page. So there are some tips and tricks, but before we get to that, just to kind of give you a better idea of where you see some of these ensemble casts, we've put together kind of a list of some popular television shows, some popular books that you may have read. And so, of course, one of our favorite examples going on right now on television is The Big Bang Theory. What do you think of that, Pops?
It's, well, I love the show, and I always feel guilty about saying that, but I do. I love the show. And I threw it on the list for a reason. It consists of an ensemble, as you would expect in a sitcom, but it is also Well, the core ensemble, they're all very similar. And you think on paper, just reading it, well, you got a theoretical physicist and a practical physicist, and you have an astronomer, and then you have a guy with a master's degree in mechanical engineering, and they're really just all nerds, geeks, and so what's different? But when you watch the show, you realize they're very different, and they respond differently to situations. They help each other out, but not in perhaps the most gentle way. They can be pretty tough on themselves. And so here you have these characters that bring this hilarious show to life. Then, of course, you add Penny, who is not the bright one. She's the pretty one. So you have the outcasts, and then you have her, and that's just an excellent dynamic. And would you say Sheldon is the protagonist?
I feel like it's Leonard, simply because most of the stories do revolve around him. There are a few occasional episodes that will center around Sheldon. Sheldon, I feel, is more kind of the comic. I don't want to say the straight man, even though he plays everything straight. He's generally gets the best punchlines because of his kind of quirkiness. But I feel like the relationship between Penny and Leonard really brings Leonard to kind of the forefront, because here he is dating a girl he has no business dating. So that I would say probably Leonard, but I guess you might be able to make a case that all three of the nerds are the protagonists. I don't know. I mean, are you feeling like Sheldon is a protagonist?
I think that's right. Well, they're all protagonists, but you're right. I think that Sheldon's a theoretical physicist. He's brilliant. He's sort of a skinny Einstein kind of thing, but he doesn't fit in. In fact, he has even trouble fitting in with all the nerds and the geeks. He doesn't know what sarcasm is. He has trouble mastering all of those little intricacies, and it's partly because he's so brilliant. So he becomes really the comic relief. They're all comical, but he's the primary comic relief. So I think you're right, Leonard, who is the more practical one and the one who finally gets the girl. So yeah, he is probably the protagonist, and the others are supporting protagonists, but they're each so unique that they're unforgettable.
I like that Sheldon is the comic relief, even though he doesn't understand that he's delivering the punchlines.
Sure.
And I think that's one thing that makes him great, is he's the character who gives the punchline, but he doesn't understand it's a punchline. So there's another layer of irony there that kind of, I guess it's more kind of dramatic irony that the audience understands something that the characters don't. One of my favorite ensemble casts of all time is from a show that's no longer on television, but I think it was probably one of the best written shows in all of television history, at least the first season, and that's Lost. What a great mix of characters there. What I really liked about this, and we'll probably touch on this a little bit later, is that every character that was on screen had a particular motivation and a different motivation than everyone else, and that's what really sold me on the show, is that all these people are vying, but for the different things. Of course, they all want off the island, but then there are a couple that don't, and once they're on the island, there are different things that each character wants, and so that becomes great. It was a real great cast dynamic. The characters were very well written. I felt like things went a little off the rail in the second season on, but at least that first season, very well written, very tight. The structure of the show and everything kind of helped to highlight each of the members of the cast, and that's really what was great about that ensemble cast, is they all got their own episode or two or three to really shine, to get the backstory and to understand what makes them tick and why they do what they do on the island. So I think that's one of probably my favorite example from television.
Right, and that's what makes ensemble casts in books work so well, is they do together what an individual could not do alone. So they reinforce one another, they encourage one another, and of course in novel writing you normally have a primary protagonist. But in Lost, if you had just the one person, then you have Robinson Crusoe on the island.
Yeah.
Okay, but now that you have all these people, a doctor and a killer and a con person and all these other people there that have to interact, that leads to a bigger story, a bigger mythology for the story, for, in that case, the viewer to watch in a novel. Then the readers get to experience more and more. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was actually, I don't know if you watched the bonus disc on season one on DVD, but that was actually the original pitch was Castaway the series, and they were just going to have one person, and then that got shot down, and it eventually blew up to what it was. But that's what started. It was Castaway the series, so it would have been not as exciting just watching Tom Hanks for an hour a week for 16 weeks or whatever it was. I don't think that would have the same impact as the ensemble cast here. But we also have some great examples from literature, obviously, where you see some quality writers juggling multiple characters. One of the first ones here that you have listed, Pops, is Stephen King's The Langoliers.
Yeah, that's a very unique one, and I think it's a perfect example of what we're talking about in an ensemble cast in dramatic kinds of work. Now, his, of course, is horror. Those not familiar with it, it's in the book. It's one of the four stories in Four Past Midnight, I think. And in my opinion, it's the only good one. I didn't care for the other three, but this stuff is subjective. But I loved the Langoliers, and that later became a mini series. But when you look at the cast, you see the dynamics of it. The protagonist is a pilot who's deadheading, and those not familiar with what deadheading means is they have flown into a city, now they're going to fly home, but they're not serving as pilot. They're riding back in the passenger compartment, and then there are others. There's a spy. There's a kid whose claim to fame is that he plays the violin. There's a bad girl in it, a blind girl, and a crazy businessman who's just out of his mind. Well, you put them all in a plane. Well, now that's a lot of dynamics there. And they have to work together to get out of this, but they also end up falling apart towards the end. So, great ensemble cast. Stephen King did a wonderful job with it, and the miniseries I thought was spot on to what he had written.
It's interesting. We talked about the Big Bang, but after that it was Lost, and then it was the Langoliers, and we also mentioned Crichton's Jurassic Park here, and they're either on planes, these ensemble casts, or they're trapped on islands, and so you get this sense that one thing that helps make an ensemble cast work is setting, letting them be stuck together. It doesn't always have to be that way, but a lot of times, that can help. Sometimes I think you can really see the group dynamics really explode when they're trapped together. Putting four people in a car is going to be more interesting than four people necessarily in a house. Four people are in a house, somebody goes in a room and closes the door. But in a car, you can't do that. You can't isolate yourself. So those group dynamics continue. And it's a great way, if you are working with an ensemble cast and you really want to figure out who your characters are, throw them on a plane together and make them talk. Crash the plane on an island, find out what they do. Put them in a car on a cross-country road trip, and you can do a lot of that as exploratory writing. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the novel, but it's going to give you a good opportunity to see what those characters do and how they interact and how their motivations are different. So that's a good thing to try. Of course, there's always Star Wars and Star Trek as prime examples, the Hobbit series, Lord of the Rings as well. But Pops, you've handled the ensemble cast in several of your novels, so if you wanted to talk about those, I think the first one you did was Through My Eyes.
Yeah, which was the second book I wrote, third out, but it was the second book I wrote, and it was an ensemble piece in that I had divergent characters who were pushed together. They each have one particular quality, they each have a particular vision that leads to the overall goal. They don't know each other to begin with. Well, two of them know each other, but they're married. But they have to pull together to pull all this off. Now, again, we don't have to put them on an island. Well, the thing that can bind them together is their mission. So it doesn't have to be a plane or an island. It could be just a simple mission. And they have this mission to go on, and no one of them could have done it by themselves. They need each other. So I've got a pastor, a woman surgeon, a woman cat burglar in there, a high-end advertising man who is about to commit suicide. And anyway, we've got this team we end up putting together, and only together can they solve the problem. And I did this in another series with Major Jeff Struker when I was doing the military action adventures with him. He has a team. We put together a team of 6 people, and they would go to different places to do their army work, their mission. with that. And so that was their island. One time it's Venezuela, another time it's Eastern Siberia. The different places that they end up going to, that becomes their island, their airplane. But they have to work together. So I've got 6 people I have to juggle. I've got a primary protagonist, but I've got to remember to keep all 6 of them working through this. And that's some of the pitfalls you have to watch out for when doing those.
Right. I like that you say that the mission becomes the island, if you will. They don't have to be united by setting, but I guess what we could say is there's got to be some reason for all of these people to be together. Through my eyes, they all have visions, so they have to work together because they each have a piece of the puzzle. But maybe they don't want to work together, so there's the conflict there. Perry Sachs novels is something else where you have people working together toward a goal, as you mentioned, the ones with Jeffrey Strucker. Some great books, by the way, where they have a mission that keeps them moving forward. In a similar way, my Hand of Adonai series is an epic fantasy, and you're going to see this a lot in epic fantasies. And of course, they all have the same end goal, which is to save the world, because it's fantasy. You got to save the world. Mm-hmm. But even in something like The Implausibles, which is a book I'm currently working on, they kind of have the same thing. It's kind of an urban fantasy. They want to save the world, but then if you think of something like The Bargain that I put together, which is different because these people don't have a commonality in context of mission, but they did have a commonality in context of location again. So their island was actually this town in which they lived. Now, they could have easily gotten in a car and driven away, but the idea was something was preventing them, that they could not, for whatever reason, escape this town. And so that became a type of an island for them. And what was interesting, I guess, about that, I hate to sound arrogant, or I read a book by Ayn Rand about the craft of writing, and she kept saying things like, here's an example of fantastic writing. It's from my book. Here's an example of terrible writing. It's from F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner and all of the other writers who are better than me, but I'm going to say that they're terrible. I don't want to be that guy. But in The Bargain, you had the outsider, and that's a very common story trope where an outsider comes into this place. Imagine Lost if somebody else jumped onto the island from the outside, seeing the group dynamics from an outsider's point of view. So that's one thing that kind of maybe turned the formula a little bit on its head and made it interesting, but there was still that commonality of setting there.
Right, and you had somebody very different than your protagonist helping him out, pushing him on. I really had a couple of people, his wife's sister, so his sister-in-law, pushing him forward to do the right things, to stick with it when he wants to quit, to believe when he's not believing, all of those kinds of things. And so they become really facilitators, and we probably ought to tell the difference here in some of these characters. You have the main protagonist, that's your hero. You have supporting protagonists, that's the rest of your team or whoever else is in there that sides with the protagonist. And then you, of course, have an antagonist. That antagonist may have his or her own ensemble. And then there are ancillary characters. I call them facilitators. They're people that bring things to the table, that cause things to happen, makes the protagonist make a left turn when he would have made a right turn, that sort of thing. And they bring things about, but they're not. The book's not about them. The book's about the protagonist and what he or she is facing in those things. So in your case, you had several very strong facilitators to keep the main character on target.
And in context of archetypes, we've talked about archetypes before, but ensemble casts, you see archetypes really develop. Writers generally will pull from these archetypes. If you think of the hero's journey and you have a strong main protagonist, and in Lost you could say that's Jack. In Bargain, it would be Connor Reedley. In the Perry Sachs novels, obviously, it's Perry Sachs. But you've got a strong protagonist that's working their way toward a goal. And often you'll have, like, the loyal retainer. You'll have the mentor. You'll have somebody who teaches them how to do what they need to do. You've got, for every Luke Skywalker, there is a Yoda. But there's also C-3PO and the droids. So you get this kind of a conglomeration, a collection of different archetypes, and what's really neat about that is if you're looking at archetypes, the archetypes are different enough so that you're not going to have characters that are all carbon copies of the other. And that's one of the pitfalls that I think we'll talk about later. I'm getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but I think one of the first things maybe that we should talk about here, or one of the next things, is why. Why would we want to use an ensemble cast? What is a good reason or a couple good reasons to use an ensemble cast?
Well, in some cases, the what if question that you're writing about, it's just not going to be believable that one person can step up and do that. It would take a Superman to do it. But so there needs to be other people. So if you're reading Clive Cussler's action adventures, Dirk Pitt is the leader, but some of the most colorful characters are part of his ensemble. And so it also adds a richness to it. So not only do we see the primary character, but now we're getting more texture because they're all a little different. They bring something else. They see things differently. They speak differently. And it also gives us some very handy other points of view. Usually ensemble books are done in third person. So from time to time you can switch points of view. Now my rule on this is if your main character is in the scene, that's your point of view character. But you can send people off, or they can recoup, but you get other points of views that you can get into, other eyes you can see through. So that brings a certain richness to some stories also.
I would also argue that if your protagonist is on scene, occasionally, you don't always have to do this, but occasionally it's good to see your protagonist through somebody else's eyes. So when you're using an ensemble cast, especially if you don't have the one strong primary protagonist, if you've got multiple protagonists, sometimes it's good to see the dynamics between them. So if I'm going to throw out here my Hand of Adonai series, because it's the first thing to come to mind, and I think, quite honestly, writers use their own work as examples often because they're most familiar with it. But if you think of the Hand of Adonai series, you've got really, in the beginning, you've got 3 point of view characters. One is a point of view character because she's in a different world, and so I obviously can't narrate what happens in that world from the point of view of my 2 primary protagonists. But in the other world, in Al Ruja, I've got Oliver and Lauren, 2 very different people, but they're friends, and so they see things very differently. They have different motivations, and occasionally, if we saw everything from Oliver's point of view, we would get to know Lauren in one way. But when we get a chance to get inside her point of view, we understand that she thinks a little bit differently, and we get to see how Oliver is behaving and how she interprets that. So you get a better understanding of the full dynamics of their relationship that neither of them can fully understand on their own. And I think you'll see that I think they do that in Jurassic Park as well, where you get this interesting mix of characters and different viewpoints. And so you get to know multiple characters pretty well rather than just the one. Another advantage is it makes your world bigger, right? As you were saying, Pops, there's just some points of view. If your protagonist is not on scene, you can't tell it from their point of view. So you need other eyes through which to view the story and the action. I'll reference the Hunger Games here. Spoiler alerts coming. If you don't want to know the ending of the Hunger Games, just skip ahead a little bit. But in the books, they're in first person. In the third book, the action becomes large scale. In the first 2 books, it was no big deal because they're in the Hunger Games. They're just in one location, and the protagonist is always present on scene. But spoiler alert, at the end, when the capital finally falls, Katniss is unconscious for it. So it's like she's fighting, and then she gets knocked unconscious, and she wakes up, and the conflict has been resolved. And this felt very unsatisfying because she wasn't necessarily directly involved in the fall of the capital. She didn't get to do what you hoped she would do, and there's just a lot of action that goes on that we don't see. We just hear about from, oh, while you were sleeping, these wonderful things happen. And so that can be pretty unsatisfying. So using an ensemble cast protects you from that. You're going to be in third-person point of view, and it makes your world larger so that if one of your protagonists is knocked unconscious, you can have another protagonist pick up the scene and continue forward in the action so that the reader is not necessarily losing out on what that unconscious character is losing out on.
Right, and it also gives you a good opportunity to show emotions that would not normally be shown if you didn't have the other people in the ensemble cast. So you can show your protagonist showing love or concern or courage to protect someone in the in their ensemble cast, the people that are helping them, or you can do the same for the people in the ensemble cast. And ideally, if you're going to do several books in a series, you want other characters that people can relate to that repeat. So I did that in Perry Sachs. My characters always get beat up and never talk to me again, but I drop him down a hole, 2-mile hole in ice in Antarctica, and much to the emotive response to that comes from his friends who are still on top, who have absolutely no hope of saving him, but they're going to try. Well, now I learn more and more about what they think of the protagonist, Perry Sachs, than we would ever get through seeing the world through Perry Sachs's eyes only. So it gives us a chance to broaden the reader's experience.
And a couple things on that. That's really upping the stakes, first of all. If you drop your protagonist down, however long it was, beneath the ice, and we're going to be worried about their life. So they're down there, and we're worried for them, for their life. But we're also worried about what this potential death might hold in store, not just for the protagonists, of course we want them to survive, but what that loss will mean to the friends. And so your characters are always defined by what's on the line. What do they stand to lose? And so when you have something like that, you've got two different losses, two potential losses going on. One from the protagonist, I could die. One from the friends, I could lose my best friend. And that really adds a layer of emotional depth, like you say, that you may not be able to get in just a first-person novel. So the ensemble cast works well.
Right, exactly.
Now, what are some bad reasons to use an ensemble cast? And I think probably one of the worst is what I like to call ensemble for the sake of ensemble. Like you just want to write a very large epic scale novel, so you're just going to throw in random characters for no reason. Each character has to have a specific reason for being in the novel. They need to be doing something. If they're not, they're just taking up words. They're just taking words away from you that could be going to the characters that really need to be developed. They've got to have a specific motivation that's generally at odds with each other, not necessarily with themselves. For example, in the Perry Sachs, you've got your protagonist and you've got the protagonist's friends. You've got Perry Sachs, you've got Perry Sachs' friends. Generally, their motivations are aligned, but then you'll have the bad guys and their motivations are at odds with the good guys. But even when you see, if we're going to go to the Lord of the Rings and we've got Frodo with the ring, his motivation starts to change. He starts to be corrupted by the ring, and then Sam's got a different motivation, right? Mm-hmm. Sam wants to protect Frodo. Frodo wants to just complete his mission. And so even though they're friends, even though they both want to throw that ring in Mordor, they have different motivations for how they want to accomplish that. And that really is going to add to a lot of the conflict.
Yeah, some people want to do ensemble pieces because they think it's sexy. These ensemble books are usually they're very good. I like a good ensemble book, but if you don't have a reason to do it, then you're just asking for trouble. What you end up doing is you end up supporting characters who aren't going to move the story along. The scenes are going to be they're going to be useless. It's just going to be fluff, and it's just more juggling for you to do. But if you have people who are going to bring stuff that are going to set up what's going to happen in the future of the story, of the plot, they're integral to getting things done that the protagonist can't get done, then you have something. So a bad reason is just to have somebody to talk to, so your protagonist can talk to somebody. Well, an ancillary character would do that. But if you got somebody out there risking their neck or risking whatever it is that they love, they may lose that, and they're doing that for someone else, and you're seeing quite a few things, how important the other person is and what the supporting character in the ensemble thinks of the individual. So there's many good reasons to have it, but it does take some caution because you can trip up in it. It takes a deft hand.
And quite honestly, if you want somebody for your character to talk to and you just need a sounding board, give them a puppy or a kitty or a horse, and I say that half joking, but I mean that's if you just need a sounding board, animals really play that role, and that can really kind of deepen your character as well, because you don't have to develop a cocker spaniel. You just put a cocker spaniel on somebody's lap, and boom, we're good to go. But if you put another character there, now you need to really flesh that character out, and we need to kind of understand that character, their motivation, their psychology, etc. So you're making a lot more work for yourself. Each character that you add is going to add more to your story, more words, more pages, possibly more scenes. And if you're including an additional point of view character, that page count is going to go up tremendously. And so your book can very quickly become bloated. I know a lot of writers who have gotten toward the end of a book and had to combine 2 or 3 characters into one. And so one character will play multiple parts simply because the book was just getting out of hand. It was just getting too long and too hard to juggle things. So be aware of some of those pitfalls. Resist the urge to throw characters in just because you're friends with them. Hey, I'll put you in my next book. Like, yeah, that's fun, but if they don't have a reason to be in your book, you need to tell them politely to leave your book. Stay friends with them, but leave their book.
Yeah, maybe the next book.
Right, where they'll fit better in the next book anyway. So, if you're writing a short, fast-paced novel, you just want something that's going to come out of the gate, start hitting, and end quick. Again, you're probably going to limit the characters that are on scene there. I'm thinking of the Dean Koontz books, Odd Thomas. Right now we've got Odd Thomas, and he's got a few friends, and they're interesting, including the Ghost of Elvis. That's great, but I mean, it's a handful. You can count on one hand the amount of characters that really appear on scene more than 1 or 2 times. I'm also thinking I'm gonna say something positive about Stephen King's Under the Dome. I don't often do that. But even though he's got point of views of squirrels and groundhogs and dogs in there, he just goes into everybody's point of view. They all further the plot. The point of view when he goes into the dog's point of view, the dog does something important, surprisingly, and so there is a reason for him going into that perspective. Even though I thought it was a little bit gimmicky, he's made millions of dollars. He knows a lot more about writing than me, so I'll cut him some slack. But at some point, he did honor that idea, that rule, if you will, to keep the characters in the scene for a particular reason. They all further the plot as things go along.
Yeah, that happens sometimes when you don't have a point of view character available. I did that in one of my books where I wanted to show what caused a tsunami. And before I could do that, I had to show what was going on at the bottom of the ocean. Well, I couldn't have a character there, and I couldn't do a point of view from a crab. So I just stepped out and did this omniscient point of view thing and described the ballet of the plates beneath the ocean. And I think that's largely what he did in Under the Dome with, I think it was in Armadillo, maybe. And Dean Koontz did it once in one of his books with a dog, which was it was hilarious. But that's Dean Koontz, that's Stephen King. They've got millions of extra words of practice than most of us do. So
I think the rule is once you've made your first million in book sales, then you can start using animal points of view. I think that's the rule.
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. I'd say once you get that good, once you really know what you're doing, then you can probably pull it off. Well, if you've made a lot of money, then the editor's not going to argue with you much. But
I've read some books like that from some best-selling authors, and I keep thinking at some point, like, how do you tell Tom Clancy you want to cut a scene? He just goes, "Yeah, I'm Tom Clancy." Yeah, sure, okay, we'll leave it in there. Yeah. So some other traps of ensemble casts. Probably the biggest thing. You've got 4 or 5 people in a room, or in a car, or on an island, or in an airplane, and they're going to have some conversation. One of the temptations is to try and carry a lot of the action through dialogue and to retell a lot of information through dialogue. That can kind of just develop into this hot, steaming pile of mush, and it can get really kind of confusing. So when you've got multiple people on scene, Pops, how do you try and handle the dialogue?
Yeah, it is difficult. I'm thinking about one of the military action adventures, and I have the team, and there's 6 of them and a driver, and it's a UPS truck is what it is. They're in the back of a UPS truck. It's been altered, but they're in the back of a UPS truck. And I've got them all stuck together, and they're on a long drive. And I didn't want to just skip and say, and then they arrived. I wanted to be able to show some of the frustration they're feeling. So that's what I did. I gave them an extra sense of frustration. I made it a rough ride. A couple of them don't trust the driver. And then I would try to put action in. One of the supporting characters in the ensemble, he's the second team leader. That big guy, and the electronics guy is complaining that he can't get enough signal. He needs to be able to put an antenna out of this truck, and big guy pulls out his field knife and slams it through the aluminum above his head, peels it back, and says, "That do it?" Okay, and it did. So I got to be able to use those two characters and the new guy who just inches away from the big guy. And so we're seeing more and more of their characters, but they're all in a confined space. And the scene terrified me. I just wasn't sure I was going to be able to pull it off. It worked out, but it was I went in with fear and trembling with whether or not I could have 7 people in a conversation in a moving truck in the middle of the night and not fall back into he said, she said. You have to use those tags. Usually when you have 3 or more, you almost have to have them in. But you can also use beats. You threw an angry glance, he pulled his knife, whatever it might be. You can use action instead of the tags, but you'll be using more tags when you have a bunch together, and you just have to put up with it.
One of my rules for dialogue is never to use character names inside of dialogue if only 2 people are talking. So right now, Pops, if we're having a dialogue, I wouldn't say, "Gee, Al, what do you think about that?" Because obviously I'm talking to you. We're the only 2 on camera. I know I do it in real life, but in the text, you shouldn't do that. And the reason is because it's just an extra word. The reader already knows who you're speaking to. However, if you've got 3 or more on scene, that rule goes right out the window. And occasionally you'll say something, because you have to, right? "Bob, what do you think about this?" or whatever the case may be. So the next line is just, "I think it's a terrible plan." So we know that's Bob talking. Number 1. Number 2, I think one thing that you really want to try and do is establish a particular way for each of these characters to speak. Their dialogues, their cadence, their rhythm, their vocabulary, their particular worldview, those all need to kind of combine into their manner of speaking. In the Hand of Adonai series, whenever something sarcastic is said, we know it's Erica. I had one character say something sarcastic, and somebody said, "Now you sound like Erica." And that's because she gets those lines. That's who she is. She's very jaded, and she's just kind of that character. So trying to differentiate with their style of speech, you can do that as well. But like you say, those beats, the action, trying to add those in to kind of break things up a little bit is definitely something that you want to do.
And the beat on that would be, he studied Bob for a moment. And then you do the quote, "Did you lose another marble out of that thick skull of yours?" Close quote. Now you know he's talking to Bob because he was just looking at Bob. So he doesn't have to address him by name. And you don't have to say, "He said to Bob." So you use the beat when possible, but if you use too many of them, they become as noticeable as a dialogue tag. So you use a little of each. My rule of thumb is I take out as many as I can until the scene breaks. If I don't know who's speaking, then I'll put a tag in, or I'll put a beat in, unless the beat's important for something that's about to happen. I'll put that in, but I try to use as few as possible, take out as many until it breaks, and then I put a few in.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the things that we were talking about in context of everybody talking the same. If all of your characters behave in the same way, if they all become clones of the protagonist, or even if they're clones of each other. So if Perry Sachs is your protagonist and you've got 3 or 4 auxiliary characters that are all identical in the way they speak and think and behave, why are there 3 when one can do the job? So when you're creating an ensemble cast, one of the traps is your characters become too similar, and so you want to kind of differentiate those, which we can kind of talk about, I think, a little bit later on ways to differentiate those. But you also want to, this is the one that I'm so terrible with, characters disappearing from the scene. Oh man, in the Hand of Adonai series, going back and rereading, and I think, wait a minute, 2 pages ago she had her dog with her, and now the dog is gone. Where did the dog go? And simple things like that can become problematic, especially if you have a conversation and with 4 or 5 people, and then one disappears randomly because only two are talking, and they talk so long that you forget that there's one or two other people present on scene. That can be kind of the challenge there too. Do you have any advice on that? Is there some way you handle that?
Well, yeah, you bring up a great point, and this is a mistake many new writers make, is they introduce the characters and then they just disappear. And I see that all the time when I'm reviewing books for maybe for a publisher. I'm doing some editing. I say, well, what happened to this person? And the writer will be honest and say, I just forgot about him. Well, if you forgot about them, then they probably don't need to be there.
Exactly.
Take them out of the scene, or otherwise you have to somehow include them in there. But it gets it's just a common mistake where they're there, then they're gone. In the movie business, they call it continuity problems. Usually it's little things like somebody's drinking a soda at a restaurant and the glass is full, then it cuts away to 2 lines of dialogue with the person they're talking to, and then they cut back and the glass is half empty, and your first thought is, wow, that guy's really thirsty, and they cut back to the other person, they cut back again, and the glass is full again. Well, what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of these are done in single camera shoots. So they do the scene more than once, and they have the camera on character A, and they do the whole scene, and then they switch over to character B, and then they do the whole scene, and then they edit them together. And if you're not careful, little things of continuity will mess you up. And I, for some reason, notice those things all the time. Well, it's the same thing in writing. If I walk into a room and I have 3 characters and one never does anything or says anything, then my readers are going to say, well, why is he there? What happened? Did he disappear? And so you have to somehow keep them involved. And so that takes a little planning.
Yeah, planning is a good thing. It's okay if characters disappear if they're magicians, but short of that,
Well, you'd still have to show them disappearing.
I guess that's true too. So, but yeah, you definitely. I like what you say. If your character, if you, the author, has forgotten about a particular character, it's probably a good sign that they need to find their way out of the novel. And a lot of times they're there just to deliver 1 or 2 lines, or to show up at just the right time to give the protagonist exactly what they need. At that point, they're Deus ex machina, and so you need to find some way around that. But even worse is when your protagonist disappears, or if you forget your protagonist is on scene, or how about this one, the scene stealers? How do you handle that?
I try not to get into it. Yeah, what you're saying is certainly true. That there are facilitator characters, and they're there just to bring the meal. They're there to maybe give a little bit of advice. This is how you get through town, and they're really unimportant. They're not going to play a role in the end. My rule of thumb is if my main character, if my protagonist is in the scene, then I do everything from that person's point of view. Only on rare exceptions have I broken that rule, and that was to show something I needed the reader to see that the character couldn't see. So I was being true to point of view. I rarely do that. If my main character's there, it's his eyes, her eyes that we're seeing through. If the character's not there, then I have another primary character in the ensemble who usually steps up, and we see things through his or her eyes. So the best way is just to do it right in the beginning, be thoughtful, and be careful. Be willing to send some people packing, be willing to add some dialogue if necessary, but make sure there's a reason. There's an economy in writing, I guess is what I'm trying to say, Aaron. And what I teach my students is that when you're writing, if you're going to write a scene, that scene either must tell us something about the protagonist, or it must, by action, move the story forward, or it must set up something that's about to happen or will happen later in the story, the hidden gun kind of thing that you see in television sort of thing. If it doesn't have those 3 things, it doesn't belong.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was thinking a little bit about the scene stealers that come on stage and really steal the scene. Erica in the Hand of Adonai series is definitely one of those characters. She was going to be auxiliary, but she really started stealing the show. If I'm going to reference a popular example here, I'll say The Dark Knight, which I've just watched again recently. If you watch that film, I would maintain this is not a Batman film. It is very much a Joker film.
Wow.
He is by far the most interesting character, and I'm not going to say that I was rooting for him, but there was a certain and you saw this a lot with some of the audiences that related more to the Joker because of his thought process. He was actually he was definitely the smartest guy always on scene, and he understood people in a way that nobody else could. And so I really feel like that's very much a Joker movie more than a Batman movie. Batman was there, he was present, he had his motivations, hooray. But at some point, I'm much more interested in the Joker. I'm not rooting for him. Obviously, I'm still rooting for Batman to win, but he was the one I wanted to see. And I think with that, the way I handled it in The Hand of Adonai is I let her have her own point of view. I gave her her own storyline, and I decided I'm going to feature it. She's not one that is going to disappear. She's gonna do what she needs to do, and there's a lot of strength in her character. And her character, I think, has really become one of my favorites. And so I think you have a couple options. I think the best option is just to feature them. Maybe they deserve their own point of view. Maybe you need to give them a little more page time. Otherwise, if you're worried that they're going to detract too much from your protagonist, maybe they can't exist in the same book as your protagonist. Or maybe you need to do some work with your protagonist so that they're actually a little more, I guess, interesting and more compelling for the reader.
Yeah, your protagonist should be... If you walk into a crowded room, the protagonist is the one you're going to notice. If you have enough information, or even if it's a person who's a wallflower but has some special skill, you will ultimately, that will be the person you will be most attracted to, most want to follow, most want to learn about. And so they become the dominant character. They don't have to be Batman. They don't have to be the Joker. They could be someone else, but a little more reserved. But nonetheless, the reader is going to suddenly associate with that person and stay with them. They will care about that protagonist, and the ensemble cast will help them do that. They will care for that protagonist also, and so you fall in love with the ensemble people also.
Right, and that's, I guess, one of the things that we want to mention here is that we want our readers to be invested in our characters. We want our readers to care about them. And again, going back to the example of the Joker, I wasn't rooting for him, but I did care about what happened when he was on scene. And even when he wasn't on scene, I was constantly thinking, what's he doing next? And so I was invested in that character, was not rooting for them, did not necessarily like that character. Obviously the bad guy, we want to root for the good guy, but we were emotionally invested in that character. And if your character is not lending him or herself to that, then you again need to question why they're there. If they exist, I think of this, we tend to put characters in scenes in order to accomplish tasks. Somebody needs to hand my protagonist their coffee in the morning, so I'm going to make a character to do that. Okay, or you can do it with a coffee pot. When you have a human on scene, that they need to be real. And so if they're just there to serve a purpose, they're definitely not earning their place as an ensemble cast. One of the ways that you can protect against this is to make sure that you understand the motivations of each character on scene. And again, when their motivations are at odds, that's when you have conflict, and that's when your scene really takes off. Even if they're on the same team, just remember, what is my character's motivation at this point? It's not to hand the protagonist the coffee. It's to hand the protagonist his coffee so that he will notice her because she kind of likes him and is hoping that he'll start looking her way a little more often. Whatever the case is, there's a reason. There's got to be some sort of motivation behind that, and that's going to help you to understand your characters as anything more than machines.
Well, I think I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, because there are facilitator characters that make the scenes real. So, I reissued By My Hands here recently, and there's a scene where my character is in the hospital after an appendectomy, and the nurse plays a role. But the role for the nurse is to show the reader some insights into the character. So that nurse needed to be there. I gave her a name. She had dialogue a couple of times. And I learned more, the reader learns more about my protagonist because that facilitator character is there. And then she's not part of the book anymore because the scene moves outside that hospital and to other places. So she doesn't play a role anymore. So she's a facilitator. She's not part of the ensemble.
And that's, I think, what I'm trying to get at here is if you're going to have an ensemble character, I think maybe it's just a little bit different on how we term these characters. You can have characters on scene. Obviously, you're going to have waiters and waitresses at restaurants. That's fine. You don't need to have like actual robots bringing people things. But that nurse character that you're talking about is a character. She's on scene, but she is not part of the ensemble. So
Right.
her motivations in context of where she's going in her career and how she wants to eventually become a doctor are not necessarily as relevant. But if you take the time and think about them for a little bit, then that nurse becomes something more than just a nurse. She becomes kind of a person. And it sounds like from your description here, this nurse, since she's soliciting something, or he is soliciting something from the protagonist, that this nurse is aware her motivation is to serve her patients and to do this, and she's accomplishing a task while still maintaining what's assumed to be, by the general reading public, a pretty common nurse motivation.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to go that deep. If in her case, she was a bit of a smart aleck, but in a friendly way. She was playful. Sometimes you have waitresses who do the give and take with you, and that was pretty much her. The only reason that's important is it showed that my character had some of the same qualities. So they gave him an opportunity to let go with a zinger here and there, or to show frustration. That's really a different character that he does that with, but the character's there so he can vent some of his frustration. But that character is not part of the ensemble.
Okay. So I think I see what you're saying there. So yeah, at least for your ensemble characters, they should have their motivation.
Yeah, that's right. They have to have a purpose for being there. So in the military action adventure, I've got the 6 special ops soldiers together. They each bring something. They each have a personal skill. One's a sniper, one's electronics, and so on. So they have to have. They're there because they bring something to the table. They're not just ancillary. They're not just facilitators. They're not just gingerbread. They're there, or even to be somebody to bounce a dialogue off of. They play a role. They're role players in this.
Okay, I'm curious about this. You've got 6 people on this team. They're all military men. I'm guessing most of them are career military since they're special operations. It's very, very easy to lump all of these guys into the same kind of a mold. One military man is every military man. So that would be I feel like that's a beginning writer mistake, is to have them all be clones of each other like we've mentioned. Right. What process did you go through? What things did you keep in mind when creating these characters that were really going to differentiate them so that the readers respond to each character differently?
That really, I think, goes to their personality. So I have one of the team leaders he's very aggressive. He's very outspoken, but he's also very loyal. So when the team leader calls him down, he steps back. He may not like it, and you'll know that he doesn't like it, but he does follow orders. Then I'll have someone who's new to the team, very confused about things going on, wanting to impress, but is younger, isn't as experienced, but still excels at something. For example, in one of the books, the guy operates small handheld drones for surveillance. That's his real skill. And then one, of course, is a sniper. That's his real skill. So they have reasons for being there, but their ages, their backgrounds, whether or not they're married, even their ethnic background. There's Hispanic, African American, and several whites that we put together, but even the whites that you put together are very different in their background and their experience. Even in one's very religious, one of the others will have nothing to do with that, but they still maintain a certain respect for each other. So, and then what you get there is a stew. You really don't want a broth in a book. You want a stew. They want lots of different things, very different textures, stuff like that. So I made them different both in age, in experience, in problems that they might have at home, because we always have a home story going with that. Some of the fears that they have, how they deal with problems. One goes into battle thinking he has colon cancer, but they get called so quickly and they have to respond in such short order, he just puts that out of his mind and he goes to work, but it's there all the time. What happens next, and begins to affect his work. So that gave him a little different quality than the guy who's about to get married, and I was wondering if he can continue to do this work because he may never come back. Can he do that? And so we try to show some of those different social and family things that make them different.
Yeah.
And even something as silly as this, just the biggest, baddest guy on the team loves musicals.
Right. I like that. I like the irony. I like the unexpected. I like taking the archetypes and kind of turning them on their head. I like that. For some reason, that really resonates with me when you can have a character that's going to surprise your reader in some way. I think those are the characters that really sit with us, aren't they? The big, bad, tough guy who also sits through musicals and sings, in the middle of battle or whatever the case may be. I mean, that's intriguing, right?
Yeah, many years ago, there was a football player named Rosie Greer, and he liked to do needlepoint. And everybody thought that was ridiculous, but nobody would tell him that to his face.
Right.
Just because he was that big, that tough. But he enjoyed needlepoint, and I thought that is such a great characteristic. So I have this with this guy who's, he's as muscular as can be, but he doesn't like sports. He just really doesn't like sports. And he's really sharp, very aggressive. But what he really likes to do when he wants to blow off a little steam is he likes to go to a good musical, Oklahoma or something, Phantom of the Opera, and that puts him in a good mood. And you just think this would be the last guy on earth that you would expect that from, and you would like to make fun of him for it, but it's just unhealthy.
Yeah, right. I mean, you're going to tell me you're not a fan of sports. What are you, a baby, a sissy? No.
And it becomes a later joke when he's injured. He has to get a transfusion from one of the other teammates. No, he gives the transfusion. That's what it is. Some of the teammates, and the guy begins to complain, and he thinks it's a kind of a racial thing. And he said, "Oh no, I just got this dying urge to sing a musical," and it just becomes a running joke. It's how they pal around, kind of thing, and that's what makes an ensemble stick together.
I think one of the better ensemble casts, maybe it's not one of the better ensemble casts. I'm going to go lowbrow here instead of pulling out like a Kurt Vonnegut novel or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and say Transformers, the original Transformers movie by Michael Bay, which, I mean, wow. Let's not talk about the others. But the first one has this great scene where there's this group of military personnel flying out over the desert of the Middle East, and they're talking, and one guy says to somebody, what sounds good right now is hot dog and flat beer at Boston at Fenway Park. Doesn't that sound great? And he's got this Boston accent, and then you see somebody else saying, "Oh no, it's Perfect Saturday is this or that," and somebody else says, "Man, I just want to get home and see my daughter." And they all just start talking about, like, you can tell they've been out in the field, they're eager to get back to their normal lives, but then something tragic happens, and so you can see the interplay and the dynamic on that team in less than 5 minutes. Different people, different backgrounds, they look different, they sound different when they speak, they've got different backgrounds, obviously, different motivations, they've got all that. So the other thing I'm going to throw out there, when you're trying to differentiate your cast, make sure they have different names. I've mentioned it on podcasts before. I had a Kara and an Erica, too similar, and I had to change that. I generally like to find character names that don't start with the same letter. It's just easier for people to kind of remember, okay, the name that starts with L is my protagonist, no matter how easy it is or how hard it is to pronounce. Mr. L is my protagonist, whatever the case may be. So different names is also something you want to consider.
Yeah, I encountered one a while back where I think they had 4 characters all in the same scene, and their names began with A. Mm-hmm. And I was getting very confused trying to figure out which one is which, so unless you go through and memorize all of that. So, yeah, you want to make them very different. And something you said brought this up. If you want to study the difference between ensemble and single protagonist heroes, watch The Avengers for the ensemble, the movie The Avengers.
Mm-hmm.
Great movie, great ensemble piece. Everyone's different. They get on each other's nerves. They pull together. But then you can go back and watch the individual stories. There's 2 or 3 Iron Mans. There's a couple of Thors. There's a couple of Hulk. Almost all of, not all of them, but most of them had previous movies, and you see them acting as a single hero without a lot of help. They'll have maybe some ancillary characters or maybe some supporting protagonists, but they're not really part of the ensemble per se. Thor, I think, got closest to that with that team. But anyway, those are good studies in the difference between the single hero and the ensemble piece.
You're getting at my heart. I'm actually wearing my Avengers t-shirt today. I'm drinking out of a Captain America glass. Whoa, there we go, Captain America. I'm a big fan. Avengers, another fantastic movie, so well written, great ensemble cast. Like you say, the other movies that support them or came before them, really good. You get to see the characters in their own role. You can skip the Hulk films. You have my permission. But go ahead and watch the other ones, especially the Iron Mans. That's what really kicked it off and kind of set Marvel Studios off on this incredible run. So, yeah, Guardians of the Galaxy, another good one. And the Avengers, they come together. They don't exactly like being together, but they pull together when they're supposed to. Guardians of the Galaxy, a little bit rougher in context of these characters are not as clean cut as your Captain Americas and your Thors. They're a little bit dirtier, a little underhanded, but still have the proper motivations eventually.
But isn't that a great point, though, that ensemble, that it doesn't have to be homogeneous. They can be very different. And in the one you're describing, I mean, 2 of the characters, one's a tree and one's a raccoon. But it's all believable in the way that it's portrayed. Very, very different. Yet it works.
Yeah. I am Groot.
Yes.
I think you got Vin Diesel, right, voicing the giant tree, and that's all he ever says, but you can tell, like, he's got Rocket Raccoon, who is his sounding board. I think a lot of times the more diverse an ensemble cast is, the better off it is. I love that line in Lost in season 1 where Hurley is talking to Saeed, and he says, you ever do time in the military? You go, oh yeah, I was in the military. He's, oh, I had friends in the Air Force or whatever. They were, what were you in? And he goes, I was in the Iraqi, what is it, the Republican Guard. I was in the Republican Guard, and he just kind of looks at him like, what? Oh yeah, that's interesting. Now we've got somebody who is technically on the enemy side with a bunch of Americans, and there's some tension there. So the more diverse your cast is, I think a lot of times the more success you can have. So how can you make them different? That's definitely one of the things that you want to consider. Anything else, Pops, that you wanted to add to this?
No, I think we've probably busted through our time already, haven't we? Yeah. So, I mean, it could go on all night. There's quite a bit of good stuff with that. I would just say one last thing, that you can have an ensemble that doesn't want to be together, but there's something more important, that they're willing to become that. And then there's ensemble that want to get together. They're going to hang out. They're going to be friends. So it doesn't matter if they're close or they're not. What will bring them together is whatever their mission is, whatever the goal is.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can people get in touch with you, Pops?
Well, the altongansky.com, and as you can see, it's Gansky with a Y, and there you can get all the latest Writer Talk interviews that I've done, and we'll probably be bringing up something new fairly soon, but you could see those. If you're interested in just other writing stuff, check out the Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference. It's just the initials, BRMCWC. We talk a lot about writing. We're getting closer to the conference, so we're going to be talking about the conference more too, but there's always something about writing and some encouragement with that. If you can't remember that, you can do my-CWC. That'll get you there too. Or you can go to my site and click and go over to the...
Yeah, altongansky.com and then click.
Yeah, that'll get you there, probably the easiest.
Excellent. All right. Well, I am Aaron Gansky at aarongansky.com. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. Again, if you get an opportunity and you've got a few extra dollars, please visit the GoFundMe address below and help Crystal out. She definitely appreciates it. So Don't forget to subscribe, all you YouTube listeners out there. Go ahead and click on subscribe so you get updates whenever we put these up, including on special nights like Saturdays where we're trying to get a little bit ahead for you guys. And if you're listening on iTunes and haven't subscribed, please do. Also, please give us a rating, because that would be nice if we had some ratings there. So thank you all for listening, and until next week, good writing.